This is BS on Broadcasting. David Brody, a former national radio host and talent coach with 4 decades in the industry.
You gotta understand what the score is and where you are in the game.
And Marc Serber, a commentator who's called and hosted soccer matches for leagues and competitions around the world.
Real panic defending from DC United and continues here. And the beat is finally beaten. It's the opening goal for Chivas USA.
Together, they're on a mission to help every broadcaster be their best by learning from the best. And always talking BS. Brody, Serber on Broadcasting.
Welcome to BS on Broadcasting. I'm Marc Serber alongside Sean Meadow. And our mission is to help all sports broadcasters be their best by learning from the best. And we certainly have somebody who can give us a tremendous amount of insight into what producers and executives are looking for from on-air talent in Jonty Whitehead, who's currently the president and founder of Sport Buff, has also been the head of sports in the MENA region for BeIn Media Group, and the former executive producer for Fox Soccer, as well as Soccer at Fox, once it all rolled into Fox Sports 1 and 2. Jonty, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. First of all, just tell us about your path and how you got into the business and the steps you took along the way to get to where you are now.
Yeah, thanks. And hello, guys. Yeah, I was very fortunate in that I always knew what I wanted to be at a time when it wasn't sort of known about. I always wanted to be a football producer right back before university even. So that made it slightly easier. And the reason I think for that is that my dad was a massive football fan, Sheffield Wednesday fan, and was never good enough to play the game. So always wanted to be involved in some way. He was also an actor, so there was that natural, he still is an actor, that natural balance of television and sport. And so, when I went away to university, anyone asked me what I wanted to do, I want to be a football producer. When I left university after 3 great years in Sheffield, I applied to what were the 4 broadcasters in the UK at the time, BBC, ITV, Channel 4. And I was lucky enough to receive sort of interviews with both the BBC and ITV, and Sky B or Sky Television. It was just in its initial period. It had a satellite channel. It didn't have any sport, but it was one of those things that my mum one morning at breakfast said, why don't you apply to Sky Television? I did that. I received an interview very quickly. Within that interview, they said, do you want to start tomorrow, basically? So I started at a very junior level, but happened to be at the right place at the right time. Subsequently, within the next couple of years, they signed the rights to the Premier League. I was just desperate to get involved in that particular project. So my first involvement with the Premier League was on that opening Super Sunday when Nottingham Forest and the great Teddy Sheringham goal. I was running in replays in the VT truck. And from there, I went on to produce, from there to sort of oversee their Super Sunday content, their Monday Night Football content, their Champions League content. Was then after 20 years, in fact, there, so sort of from man and boy, I took it right through to that Champions League production. Was asked by Nasser El Khalifi, who's the chairman, president of PSG, but was also instrumental in the launch of BeIn Sport. It was Al Jazeera Sport at the time. He asked me to come over and launch an English-speaking sports channel for them, which I did. After 3 years there, David Nathanson got in contact from Fox and said, would I be interested in coming over and helping out with Fox Soccer? I did that. That, as you said previously, Mark, that transitioned into looking after the soccer for Fox Sports 1. Had a fantastic time in LA for 5 or 6 years. And then I moved into a consultancy role with Fox because Sport Buff was a really passionate idea that I'd had with the co-founder, the other founder, Ben Achillias, about proper fan engagement. Subsequently, Nasser asked me to go out for lunch in Paris. We chatted and he said he wanted me to come back. So I returned to Doha and was head of sport for the BeIn Media Group for a couple more years. Had a great time, but that second year was COVID. and whatever code it did, it advanced a lot of technologies, and the engagement that Sport Buff provided had a lot of take up. So the company grew, and I decided to step away from that sort of more traditional executive role to come and be my own boss and to live or die by my own decisions. And I think I've enough experience to understand the way that a digital solution can fit into a traditional linear broadcast. And Ben, who's the other founder, has that digital background about fan engagement. So I think we slot in really well together. Sorry to go on. I think that covers it all.
It's awesome. I think it's so important to understand kind of career trajectories and how you get in and work your way through. If you wouldn't mind indulging me for a second, I just want to tell you a quick story. Me and my friends growing up in the late 80s, early 90s were, a small group of what was then considered a bunch of weird kids because we were soccer mad. But also, growing up back then, you didn't have the kind of information overload that you have now. And so not understanding why Sheffield Wednesday was called Sheffield Wednesday, we just thought it was the greatest name. And so even though we played on a team called the Bethesda Lightning, we called ourselves the Wednesday. And then every tournament we entered where we didn't have to enter officially, we entered as the Bethesda Wednesday. So that's where my love for Sheffield Wednesday came from, was just this obsession of there being a team called Wednesday. That's so cool. So yeah, just thought I'd share that with you guys. The great thing for listeners is that if they're not soccer fans, they can just fast forward through that part. But, let's get into the reason you're here. Is we want to know, as somebody who's been an executive producer, somebody who makes the decisions when hiring talent, what are you looking for when you are judging talent?
In terms of commentary, I would say ability to understand your audience. I think significantly, where you broadcast to is very different, and therefore there's different needs supplied on a commentator or broadcaster. So that is understand your audience, have a distinctive voice, and be authentic. There's nothing worse than screaming and shouting if it doesn't come from the heart. I think the ability to receive feedback is vitally important. I worked for many years with John Strong over at Fox, and I think what was always really, really interesting was John was having the ability to sit down with him and to talk and to go over various commentaries and see where he felt he'd done well, where I felt he'd done well. And those two parts of a production are not necessarily the same. There's so many roles that a commentator plays, in that he's got to steer a viewer through a 90-minute game. And one of the things that I like my commentators to do is to reset every 15 minutes or so for a new audience, so that without saying the same thing every time you hit that 15 minutes mark, but you just repeat what's gone on in the game, the big moments, those particular moments that would make a highlights reel, for instance. I think it's really important for a commentator to share that with the audience. The ability to be light and dark, I think that's really important in a commentator. Some commentators, they're 100 miles an hour all the time, and when you get a hat trick of perfect hat trick, they've actually nowhere to go, so that you don't get that contrast. And one of the best skills that is often overlooked as well is the ability to get the best out of your co-commentator or color commentator, as you guys would call them, to play on their strengths, to let them tell the audience something that they don't know, because ultimately those are the guys that have played the game. Those are the guys that, although they sometimes don't know it, have real insight, that as a football fan, as we all are, but not having been in that locker room, not having been on the back end of that challenge, or know what it's feel like going into the last 10 minutes of the game being 1-0 down and your season on the line. It was last night with the Everton Burnley game. I thought Rob Hawthorne, who did the commentary, did a fantastic job of the twos and fros in that game, but hitting the heights when that winner went in for a British audience. He was commentating for Sky. He really hit the high notes, and that's what you want. And it's also to embed the commentator, to let them understand TV, because if they're coming in from radio, it's a very different method of working. You've got a visualization of what you're trying to say already for the viewer, so you don't need to add too much. And then the ability to let the atmosphere come through. And again, it's something that American commentators are really good at, less so in the UK. It drives me mad now, where often in the UK, you'll hear a commentator say, and the atmosphere here is absolutely terrific. You could hardly hear yourself. Just lay back. Let us understand what the atmosphere is like. You know, the audio now delivered by major broadcasters is so good. People have these expensive bits of kit with Dolby surround sound, and yet it's the commentator that's bleeding through, and it should be the fans, the atmosphere. So to answer your question, there's a whole host of things, but I would say the primary drive is that distinctive voice, to understand their audience and really to be authentic.
And I have one more question before I pass it over to Sean. But so as a producer, back in the olden days, you might have 50 to 60 tapes on your desk. Now I'm sure it's 50 to 60 emails of digital audio file. First of all, how do you find the time or decide when you're going to go through them? And once you do open one, what is it exactly that you're looking for from a reel?
In terms of commentary, again, it's really difficult to put your finger on it, but having a voice that you immediately recognize. You don't want a homogenous sound. You want a sound that, if you listen to Martin Tyler, if you listen, to Peter Drury, if you listen, they all have their own unique style, but they also have their own unique tone. And Keith Costigan is a great example, and someone who I feel very proud to have played a big part in his development, because what Keith has a lovely sort of Irish lilt to his voice. So number one, you've got that part, you've got that tool, if you like, you've got that arrow to your bow. You know that you're working from a solid core. Uniquely, Keith has that player perspective that no other real commentator has. There's a real understanding of tactics, having been involved with the game. He would tell you a high level, but I would tell you a pretty low level. But that understanding of the 90 minutes of football really provides that a unique understanding of the game, and therefore that ability when he's working with a colour commentator to try and get the best out of them by posing questions sometimes he'll know the answer to, but he's putting that talent, that commentator, that co-commentator into the spotlight as well. It's like giving him a good pass so that he can excel and show his worth.
Something I wanted to ask about is just, you mentioned audience so much early on, and I think it's so important understanding the audience for the broadcasters, but the producers as well, right? You have to set up the show and what you're going to talk about throughout a game. And I just want to know, like, when you go into a broadcast, say with Major League Soccer, you have an audience that might not know as much about the storylines as maybe an audience watching the Premier League. I think here in the US, you have very educated Premier League fans, maybe not as educated MLS fans on the whole league. Yeah. So how do you approach a broadcast when you have different audiences? How does your job change match to match?
That's a great question, Sean, and one that I used to pose to myself every day I worked in the States. I came as one thing and left very much as another thing, and that's because as a broadcaster, we need to get our broadcast, our game, our production to the biggest possible audience. So therefore, you have to speak to the biggest possible audience. And when I went into Fox, I felt I would be that British producer who would try and get everything to be said in the same way as it is in the world of football back in the UK. And very quickly, especially working with Fox, I realized that we were missing out on opportunities then. and that in order to make the production sticky, so that an American sports fan dived in, we didn't want to make it too inside baseball, so that they didn't understand exactly what the references were for. So it's reaching a tone and a level that gives context. That's something I always say to any of the producers that work. Always think, am I giving context to this game, this moment in the game, this piece, this feature? What is it about? What context is it delivering to provide to help within the storyline? So I think very soon I realized that we had to pitch it at a different level, working with Eric Shanks for a long time, who understands an American sports audience. It's fine for PK. It's fine for those different nuances that an American soccer fan has, and I think it's important to speak to that audience, to not be condescending, to not be too British, but to be inclusive in everything that you say and everything you do. So football in America has an absolute long, wonderful history, and you should embrace that. You should be very proud of that, and you should speak to that, because why there is this, and it's okay because I'm removed now from your market, why there is this tendency and this will to put English voices on your broadcasts, I really don't understand. The fact that Ian Darke will do your national team games as an Englishman, it drives me mad. If we had a Scotsman come in and do an England game, it would drive us mad. And there's no other country in the world that produces their football for a different audience. Do you see what I'm saying? So if you're watching French productions, there's a very unique style about them. It's arty, there's slow mixes during the game, and the commentators are very verbose and verbal. Mexico, even if Mexicans are covering the Premier League, they do it in a Mexican style. They have Mexican commentators within it. And yet, uniquely in the US, there's still this tendency to have British voices as a unique part of their broadcast. I personally don't get it. All of television is absolutely subjective. But I remember seeing an NBC feature where they sent the two Robbies and over to the UK to experience life, games in the UK, along with Rebecca, and that's like Englishmen going back to England. That should be Americans going and eating hot dogs and experience, what it's like in the away end and having a pint before the game. And what's this food? Those are missed opportunities to me. So it's a fascinating topic. It's one that I loved being involved in when I worked in the States, and it's unique to your part of the world, I think.
Yeah, and as an American voiced commentator and also an Oregon alum, hearing John Strong at the World Cup calling the final, calling huge games was just refreshing. And I know when, Gus Johnson came in, it was like, okay, this is maybe even actually a start where we are going to hear American accents on games that are not played between two American clubs and, in fact, European clubs, but or countries in the case of the World Cup. But and you don't get everything right, but it's important to try. And Gus was a lovely guy. He worked really, really, really hard, and I think in the end, I think the feedback was so not positive, if you like, that I think it began to affect his performance. And but that's part of the journey. I think it's part of America finding its sort of voice and understanding this is the level we should pitch it at and to speak to that biggest possible audience.
That's actually something that I wanted to ask you about. Not Gus Johnson specifically, but you as you said, TV is so subjective. People's thoughts on commentators are obviously so subjective. How, as a producer, do you strike a balance when maybe you and your crew think that your commentator is doing a really good job, and yet Twitter or other social media seems to hate them?
I think Twitter is an echo chamber, if you like, and you're not going to get people coming on and saying this commentator's all right. You're either going to, it's both ends of the spectrum and skewed towards that negative end of the spectrum. So I think 10 years ago, television executives took a lot of thought about what Twitter was saying much more than they do now. I honestly don't think it matters. I think people are smart enough now to understand that it can have a negative influence, and without being arrogant or being provocative in any way, if you're working with people that have been involved in this industry for many, many years, and it is their focus and their career and what they've studied and what they've done, then they have the right to try things out and they have the right to make mistakes. And there's no black and white in television. It is all subjective. There is no right or wrong. The way that broadcasts have developed over the years are through trial and error. There's a quick story in the UK. The expression "back to square one" comes from football commentary that was done in a very different way on a radio, where people had a grid and they tried to tell you where the ball was within that grid, and it didn't work, and it evolved. And it's like, Sky recently invested a lot of money in 3D coverage of football. It didn't particularly go down well. And it's sort of to bring in what I'm doing now. I think it's time to hear from that audience, because right from when I started to now, football is produced, and most sports are produced in exactly the same way. It's a lean back experience. So the production team decide on what goes into the show. The game takes care of itself. There's some analysis at halftime. There's some analysis at the end. The only people you don't really hear from is the viewers, the people that are watching. And if you do, it's on another platform to someone else's benefit. So if it's a great goal, they're talking about it on Twitter. If it's a funny thing said in your studio, people are talking about it on Instagram or other social media platform. I think what should happen now, what Sport Buff can provide, is a way of taking all those engagements and bringing them back across the broadcast, so that you don't have to leave those rights that a broadcaster has paid many amounts of money for. You can interact, you can talk to your friends as you would during a game via WhatsApp, you can check the stats on a particular goal scorer, or you can lay a bet. I think the time has come to also be able to steer a production. If you put it out to the viewers at the end of the first half, there's 2 or 3 so-so incidents, and then there's a big VAR decision. Do you want to just focus on that VAR decision at half time? I'm sure that the vote would be, yeah, let's just talk about that. And again, at the end, who do you want to speak to? What questions do you want to ask? And I think that's the way a younger generation interact with the rest of their media. So it's time now for that service to be offered into those viewers, because it's vital for broadcasters to talk to that younger generation, because they're the subscribers of tomorrow. They're the people that will be paying the bills tomorrow. And if they don't address them, then they're going to miss out. I had a couple of beers with a very good friend of mine, Duncan Walkinshaw, in Doha last week. And he says his son is absolutely football mad. He's always on TikTok. He's always looking at skills. He's always looking at great goals, highlights. He said the one thing that he doesn't engage with is the 90 minutes of the match itself. And that's such a shame, because that's what we love. But we need to bring these guys in to the fold and get them back in love with the game, because it's a very different world that they're growing up in than we were growing up in, and it's a different world I was growing up in to you guys, because I'm a little bit older, I think.
Yeah, I mean, how do you see the industry changing? How do you see this broadcast looking like in the future? And how can on-air talent prepare for this change? What can they do to better themselves when they have the chance to become the broadcaster in what would probably be a changed industry?
I think they need to, Alexi is one of the most intelligent broadcasters I've ever worked with. And one of the things he used to do every day when I was there, he would go on air, in effect, on his own personal Twitter feed or whatever, and just talk to his audience and see what triggered them, and see almost like a stand-up comic going through the motions of getting his set together. And then Alexi would turn up at the weekend and he would have points that he knew he wanted to bring up. So that ability to be able to throw the question to the audience, to bring them in, to be inclusive, to be engaging, I think is the way that the productions will change. I think it's important that we move away from that tradition, and there will always be the need for a traditional lean-back audience when a game is so big and so huge that you just want to sit yourself down and soak it up. But there's so much football on now that to engage people with huge parts of it, you need something that ties it all together and brings it all together. That's certainly something that Sport Buff can do. And in some ways, that role of the commentator will change for certain. There's so much streaming around now. Football games, soccer games are presented in many different ways now, and that sort of watch-alongs or sidecast, if you like. That moderator role is one that I think will expand over time. So it's not just giving, what's going on in the game. People can watch that if they want, but there might be a role for watching it with a few ambassadors or former players and bringing their viewpoint into the game. So it's very different from a traditional commentator role. It's more of a moderator or a host role that's sort of across the stretch of the game. So, I think that's something that people can focus on. I think that's something, Twitch, for example, is something that we've done a lot of work with. And there's a whole community out there who watch sport, watch their esport in a very different way, where they're interacting the whole time. They're hearing from other viewpoints. And that's definitely the way that we're going. But to go right back to the very beginning, what Sky and the success of Sky, it was all about offering viewer choice. And I think that's what modern technology allows broadcasters and rights holders and federations to be able to do, offer different experiences for different fans.
That's great. I think Twitch is huge. I've seen like NWSL games on there where you just see fans having full conversations about every topic, whether it's from the commentating to the actual game on the field to general storylines. And that is just like a community that you wouldn't have had prior. I mean, even my dad's in a WhatsApp group with Man United fans around the world, and he's got buddies from South Africa, England, and all over, just all messaging at once. And that's crazy to think.
They're not having a good time at the moment, though. Yeah.
No.
It's miserable. It's miserable. But on a lighter note, just you mentioned some commentators: Keith Costigan, John Strong, Martin Tyler, Peter Drury. But who are some others that, even not soccer, not football, that you think young commentators should be watching? Even hosts, anyone who you're like, this is the right cadence, this is the right delivery, they know how to run a studio, things like that. Just who are some of those names that some people could look up to?
There's Rob Hawthorne, who I mentioned was on the game last night. Ian Crocker again. In terms of hosts, I loved working with Rob Stone. Stoner was, where he was brilliant, he understood that that American sports fan and the soccer fan, and could speak to both. And I think, you know, he's only got better and better. You know, he's got such experience now across multiple sports, but also authentically within the soccer community. You know, the golf commentators, NBC, again, I love Jim Nantz and those guys, I think have a real authenticity to their sport, and I enjoy sort of things that just feel right, that feel natural. Kate Abdo, I think, has you know, done brilliantly with her coverage of soccer, and that authenticity again in the boxing world where she's growing and developing. So, you know, I was in a fortunate position to work with Al Jazeera Sport, as it was then, where we produced a lot of soccer content from the UK that went to a Middle Eastern audience. So in effect, I had the pick of all the best British broadcasters around, and you know, we used Gary Lineker in our Champions League studio, and then we paired them with, you know, the likes of Alan Shearer, with the likes of Ruud Gullit. A quick story about that is that obviously when they first appeared on screen after their parting of ways, if you like, when Ruud was in charge of Alan at Newcastle, and I wanted to get them both on to a game, and but they hadn't spoken for quite some time. So I remember phoning Alan and saying, look, I want you to come on. Ruud's going to be on. I'm not hiding this. Is that okay with you? And he said, that's absolutely fine. What did Ruud say? And then I spoke to Ruud and I said, look, Alan's going to be on the show. Is that okay with you? He said, that's absolutely fine. What did Alan say? And we got them together. And Terry Venables was actually the other pundit that day. And he did a great job of just digging them in the sides and getting that reaction and that chemistry that really helps a production. You know, sometimes you can hear a studio, and they're just going down the line and you're hearing various topics and bit of analysis here. Where it becomes really engaging is when they're having a laugh, when, you know, it's why Sky now, I think, employ, you know, Gary Neville and Jamie Carragher. You guys won't get to see a lot of those two together, but Jamie, I know, is on NBC Champions League coverage for CBS, and you know, that produces always some fun and some viral social media content.
We can't thank you enough for your time today and for all the wonderful advice and insight that you've given. Before we ask you the final questions that we ask everyone, where can we find you across social media and other platforms, and where can we learn more about Sports Buff?
Yeah, so our website is sportbuff.com. It will tell you all about what we do there, the journey, the story. And, you know, as I've said, we aim to provide fans around the world with a voice, to get involved with productions, to get involved with our partners, and to have their say, but to have their say in a moderated way, that they don't have to leave the production for, they don't have to leave the game that they're watching.
And how about you, your own personal Twitter, Facebook, Instagram handles and whatnot?
It's all just Jonty Whitehead.
Awesome. Well, I know you'll definitely have some new followers after this. The final two questions that we ask everybody is, first of all, knowing what you know now, what would you go back and tell the young Jonty Whitehead that is just starting out in the business?
That's a good question. I think to embrace every opportunity as they come along. I think it's something that I've done well in the later part of my career. I think initially, you know, I was at Sky 20 years. There is a reticence to move on because you're enjoying what you do so much. So I think definitely to enjoy change and to take it on. A piece of advice I give a lot of people that come through my office doors is always, when they reach a crossroad in their career, is whatever decision you make, it's the right one, because it can't afford not to be the right one. So never look back, never think, well, what if I'd taken that? Just make that decision as you feel it, and you've made the right decision. There is no other way of looking at things.
That's really awesome advice. Yeah, if you're always worrying about what you didn't do or what decision you didn't make, then you can't move forward in the decision that you have made. Yeah. So really, really appreciate that. I think that works more than just in broadcasting, but in life as well. Final question is, what is something that you would want to tell those who are just starting out in the business that you feel maybe they're not being told or they're not getting in their introductory classes that they should know?
I think it goes back to a point that you've sort of mentioned a couple of times on this podcast. And it's that television is subjective. So your viewpoint is as valid as the next guy. As long as you can justify in your head why you've come to that decision or why you think that, then your viewpoint is as valid as the next man's. Just because something's being done in a certain way for many, many years doesn't mean it's necessarily the right way or the only way. It just means it's that way. So yeah, always have confidence in your own voice, especially if you're a proper football fan and you understand television, then it's going to be a valid opinion. And so have confidence in that, because this isn't black or white. This isn't set rules. This is television, and it's an entertainment at the end of the day.
Excellent advice from Jonty Whitehead. Thank you so much for your time today, and thank you to everybody for tuning in on BS on Broadcasting. Until next time.